Welcome to Starbound's Fantasy channel. My name is Carol, and I'll be your narrator for today. Before we get started with the story, go ahead, check and make sure that you're subscribed. It's 100% free, and it allows our stories to pop up in your feed more often. With that, let's get started. The summit grounds stretched across the mountaintop like a reluctant handshake. Human pavilions on one side, orcish encampments on the other, and between them, a circle of white stones where blood would soon be spilled in the name of peace. Gail watched from the edge of the human encampment, methodically wrapping leather strips around the hilt of a greatsword that seemed too massive for his lean frame. "They're saying the orc champion crushed a boulder with his bare hands yesterday," said Merrick, the youngest of the king's honor guard. "As a warm-up." Gail nodded without looking up. "They also say he's killed 16 human champions in single combat," Merrick continued, his voice rising. "Collects their teeth." This time, Gail looked up. His face, weathered, bearing a diagonal scar from temple to jaw, showed nothing but mild curiosity. 16 is an impractical number," he said quietly. 15 will be boastful. 17 will be intimidating. 16 just shows poor planning. Merrick stared at him before a laugh escaped. "Gods, Commander, I can't tell when you're joking." "That," Gail replied, returning to his wrapping, "is the point." The gathering was the first since the War of Embers had scorched half the continent. Today's ritual combat would either cement the peace or shatter it before it could take root. From across the plateau, a horn sounded, 3 long, guttural notes. The orcs were calling the assembly. "Tom," Gail said, pushing himself upright. "Gail!" Merrick corrected himself. "The king wanted me to remind you that this doesn't need to be the death. A yield is acceptable." A mirthless smile ghosted across Gail's face. "Is that what he told the orc?" "I don't know." "Then we'll assume he didn't." Gail slung the wrapped greatsword across his back. "Besides, death isn't what the orcs fear. It's obscurity." As they walked toward the ceremonial circle, the crowd of humans parted with an almost religious deference. No cheers, no speeches. Just silent nods and averted eyes. The way one acknowledges a necessary tragedy. Unlike the humans, the orcs made a spectacle of their arrival. Drums pounded, voices raised in guttural chants. In their center stood Warlord Krug, nearly 8 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as 2 men side by side. His green skin was a canvas of ritual scarification, his tusks capped with iron. "Is that him? That's your champion?" Krug laughed like grinding stones. "The bag of bones with the big sword? I expected the great human kingdoms to send something more impressive," Krug continued, striding toward Gail. "Not this leftover." Up close, the size difference was staggering, yet there was no fear in Gail's eyes. No defiance either. Just a calm assessment, as if Krug were a weather pattern to be noted. "Our champion stands before you," King Aldemar said stiffly. "Commander Gail of the Ashguard, hero of—" "Spare me the titles!" Krug waved dismissively. "Tell me, little man, how many orcs have you killed?" Gail remained motionless. "I stopped counting during the siege of High Cairn." "Why?" "Counting implies it matters." For the first time, something like uncertainty flickered across Krug's face. The response was neither boast nor submission. "And your sword," Krug continued, nodding at the weapon on Gail's back. "It's wrapped. Don't humans name their legendary weapons?" "It isn't legendary," Gail replied, "and it has no name." "Then what makes you worthy to stand against me? I've crushed men twice your size." At this, the faintest smile touched Gail's lips. "I didn't volunteer for worthiness, Warlord. I volunteered because I'm expendable." A murmur ran through both crowds. This was not how the ritual verbal combat was meant to proceed. "Begin!" cried the shaman, striking his staff against the ground. Krug charged with surprising speed, axe held high. Gail simply wasn't there when the axe came down, having sidestepped with casual grace. Before Krug could recover, Gail's blade kissed the orc's side, a shallow cut. Krug roared and spun, swinging his axe in a horizontal arc. Again, the human moved with economy, ducking under the blow. The crowd watched in tense silence. Each of Gail's movements was minimal, precise. "Stand and fight me!" Krug bellowed, frustration edging into his voice. "I am fighting," Gail replied, circling. "Just not the way you want me to." 10 minutes in, sweat poured down the orc's massive frame, while Gail barely appeared winded. 15 minutes, and blood flowed from a dozen small cuts on Krug's arm and torso. "You fight like a coward!" Krug spat between heaving breaths. "Pecking away! No honor in it!" "Honor," Gail replied, his voice still calm, "is the luxury of the untested." Something in those words stung more than any physical blow. With a bellow that echoed off the distant peaks, Krug lunged forward, abandoning technique for pure fury. The change caught Gail off guard. The orc's axe swept in low, faster than before, and though Gail tried to leap back, the edge caught his shirt, tearing it open from hip to shoulder. The crowd gasped, not at the near miss, but at what was revealed. Krug froze, his axe drooping in his hands, as he stared at Gail's exposed torso. The human's chest and abdomen were a horror of scar tissue, not the clean lines of weapon wounds, but the chaotic patterns of burns. Massive burns. "What happened to you?" Krug asked, bewilderment replacing rage. Instead of answering, Gail looked down at his ruined shirt. With a sigh that contained neither embarrassment nor pride, he pulled it off entirely. And in that moment, the entire plateau went silent. It was the kind of quiet that seems to swallow even the wind. Every eye, human and orc alike, fixed on Gail's exposed upper body, with a mix of horror and awe. His torso wasn't merely scarred. It was transformed. The burn tissue covered him from neck to waist in patterns too deliberate to be accidental, too precise to be the result of battle. Across his chest, scale-like formations rippled in the sunlight, catching the daylight in ways that made them seem almost alive. His shoulders bore what looked like claw marks, not inflicted by violence, but placed with ritual reverence, each one symmetrical to its counterpart. And most striking of all, his back, now visible as he turned slightly, displayed an intricate latticework of raised tissue that formed characters in an ancient script forgotten by all but the most venerable scholars. Some portions of the scarring had a faint, phosphorescent quality, as if embers still smoldered beneath his skin, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. The orcish shaman pushed forward through the crowd, his ancient eyes wide with something between fear and reverence. "Those," he whispered, though his voice carried in the unnatural silence. "Those are the marks of Fierskal." "Dragon script," translated one of the human scholars for those who didn't speak the orcish tongue. The word sent a ripple of unease through the human contingent. Krug lowered his axe completely, all thoughts of combat momentarily forgotten. "How?" he demanded. "Those are sacred markings! Forbidden knowledge!" Gail said nothing. His eyes, usually so calm and detached, now held a faraway look, as if seeing through time itself. 13 years earlier, the Ashen Vale. The sky was an apocalypse of wings and flame. "Fall back to the ridgeline!" Gail shouted over the cacophony of battle. "Form ranks! Archers in the center! Shield bearers on the flanks!" Around him, the remnants of 3 human battalions scrambled to obey, their once proud formations now ragged and depleted. The valley floor behind them was littered with the dead and dying, human, elf, and dwarf alike. Thousands of bodies, some still burning, some half buried in ash that fell like gray snow. And above, circling on vast wings that blotted out the sun, were the dragons. Not one or two, as might be expected in an ordinary skirmish, but a dozen of the beasts, scales gleaming like gemstones in a spectrum from emerald to obsidian, their wingspans wide enough to cast entire squads into shadow. They were mesmerizing in their terrible beauty, and they were being driven to madness. "Commander!" His second in command, a veteran named Talus, slid down the scree beside him. Her face was blackened with soot. One side of her helmet melted into a grotesque shape. "The eastern pass is cut off. Dragonfire has triggered rock slides." "And the western approach?" Talus shook her head. "The scaled cohort has it blockaded. We're surrounded." Gail surveyed of what remained of his command. 300 soldiers where there had once been 2,000. Supplies for perhaps 2 days. No reinforcements coming. They'd strayed too far from the main force during the battle, lured by what they now knew was a feign. "We can't hold the ridgeline," he said after a moment. "The dragons can't maneuver as well in the gullies. We make 'em work for every foot of ground." "Sir," Talus said quietly, "that's a delaying action at best." "Yes." Gail met her eyes without flinching. "But every day we keep 'em occupied here is a day the main army has to prepare defenses at High Karn. If the city falls, the entire northern realm follows." Talus nodded grimly. She knew the mathematics of the sacrifice as well as he did. They weren't fighting to win anymore. They were fighting to buy time with their lives. "Sides," Gail added, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. 300 against a dragon horde? The bards will sing of us for generations." "Bards embellish, sir. I've never found that comforting," Talus said. "And don't die, and you can correct them personally." For days they held that ridgeline. Days of dragonfire and talon strikes. What felt like endless nights of huddling in hastily dug trenches while scaled nightmares prowled the darkness beyond their meager fires. They fought with everything they had. With arrows that rarely penetrated draconic scales. With spears that broke against armored hides. With desperation and fatalism in equal measure. Their numbers dwindled. First to 200, then 100, then 50. The dragons seemed inexhaustible, yet Gail began to notice something strange. Their attacks, while devastating, were often tactically unsound. They would break off at critical moments or fail to press advantages. Sometimes they even attacked each other, as if confused about their targets. One night Gail stood alone on a rocky outcropping, watching the dragons circle in the distance. Something about their flight patterns had changed. They seemed less coordinated, more erratic, as if the force controlling them was faltering. A sound behind him, the scrape of scale on stone, had him whirling, sword drawn in an instant. But what faced him was not an attack. It was a dying dragoness. She was smaller than the others, her scales a pale, lustrous silver that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Blood, darker than human blood, almost purple-black, seeped from multiple wounds along her flanks. But most disturbing was her eyes. Where dragons typically shone with ancient intelligence, hers flickered between clarity and a strange, milky opacity, as if something was attempting to claim her mind. "Ristal Nevarat," she hissed in the draconic tone. Gail, like most educated officers, knew enough to understand. "Kill me, warrior." He raised his sword, ready to grant the mercy stroke. The dragoness had clearly been part of the attack force. Every strategic instinct told him to end her quickly and return to camp. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way her eyes kept clearing, showing moments of terrible awareness. Perhaps it was simple curiosity. Or perhaps, after 13 days of death, some part of him rebelled at causing more, even to an enemy. "What happened to you?" he asked instead, lowering his blade slightly. The dragoness blinked, clearly surprised by the question.
Voskirith,
She managed.
Andui sorcery.
Gail knew of the Andui, a reclusive order of magic practitioners who had remained neutral during the early years of the war. Rumors had circulated that they'd finally chosen a side. If they were behind this dragon assault... "They're controlling you," he said. "All of you."
Trying,
The dragoness corrected, each word clearly an effort.
Some resist better than others. The young ones.
Her voice faltered. "Your offspring?" A shudder ran through her massive frame.
Hatchlings. 5. Hidden in the high caves if the Andui find them.
She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Gail had seen what the controlled dragons did in battle. If the sorcerers gained control of the newly hatched dragons, creatures with no defenses against such magic. "Tell me about them," he found himself saying, surprising even himself with the question. The dragoness seemed equally surprised.
Why would you care?
"Because I've seen too much death," Gail replied honestly, "and I'm tired of adding to it without understanding." For a long moment she studied him, her gaze shifting between milky vacancy and piercing clarity. Then, seemingly reaching a decision, she spoke.
5. Just 16 days hatched. The oldest, a female, has scales like mine, but with a pattern like starlight across her wings. The largest, a male, is obsidian dark, already showing the crest that marks his sire's lineage. The third has earth-brown scales with gold flecks that catch the sunlight. The fourth, another female, has scales the color of sunset, always warm to the touch. And the last, her voice softened, the last is the smallest, with scales that change colors with her mood. She was last to hatch, weakest but most determined.
As she spoke, Gail found himself sitting on a rock nearby, sword across his knees, listening not to an enemy but to a mother describing her children. The moonlight cast shadows across the valley of death below them, and for a moment, it was possible to forget that they were on opposite sides of a brutal war. For a long moment he sat in silence, the weight of exhaustion and responsibility pressing down on him. His duty was clear: return to what remained of his troops and prepare for tomorrow's battle. Die with honor while buying time for the main army. And yet... "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. The dragoness's eyes fixed on him, surprise evident even through her pain.
Seraphine,
she replied after a hesitation.
Though that is the name your kind gave me. My true name cannot be spoken in your tongue.
Seraphine, Gail repeated. He sheathed his sword and approached her, stopping just beyond striking distance. "I am Gail of the Ashguard, and I think we might be able to help each other." He set to work tending her wounds.
A pact?
Seraphine echoed, her massive head lifting slightly from the rocky ground.
What manner of pact could exist between your kind and mine, in this age of dissolution?
Gail crouched just beyond reach of her talons. Behind him, the campfires of his remaining troops dotted the ridgeline like fallen stars. Time was short. Dawn would bring renewed assault. "You said the Andui are controlling the dragons," he said urgently. "How? What method?" Seraphine's eyes clouded again, then cleared with visible effort.
Soul binding,
she hissed.
They've found a way to tether our will to theirs. But it requires constant effort, concentration. That's why they haven't simply overwhelmed your forces. Each dragon under control taxes them.
And when a dragon dies?
The energy returns to them, strengthens them. It's why they're willing to sacrifice some of us in battle.
Gail absorbed this with growing horror. No wonder the attacks had been relentless, yet tactically unsound. The sorcerers weren't trying to win. They were culling the dragons to harvest their power. "You said your hatchlings are hidden," he continued, "but they'll be found eventually. And then
they become weapons,"
Seraphine finished, a tremor running through her massive frame.
Their minds still forming, unable to resist. Perfect vessels for Andui's will.
Unless we prevent it. The dragoness's eyes fix on him with sudden intensity.
How? My power wanes. The sorcery eats at me from within. By dawn, either my will or my life will be forfeit.
Gail drew a deep breath. What he was considering wasn't just dangerous. It bordered on heretical. Stories existed, ancient legends from before the great rupture between humans and dragons, of blood bonds formed in dire need. But they were just that, stories. Fragments of lore considered too fanciful for even children's tales. And yet, what if, he said slowly, you could transfer your power, not to the Andui, but to someone who would use it to protect your brood? Seraphine went very still.
You speak of the old ways, the fire sharing.
Is it possible? For a long moment the dragoness was silent, only the labored rhythm of her breathing marking the passage of seconds.
Possible, she said at last, but not without cost. The fire must have a vessel it burns continuously.
I understand.
No, human, you don't.
Her voice gained strength, urgent now.
It would alter you, mark you. The pain would be considerable.
How considerable? Seraphine's eyes, ancient and knowing, held his.
Imagine your blood replaced by molten metal. Imagine your skin rewritten in a language your flesh was never meant to speak. Imagine memories that aren't yours flooding your mind. The sensation of flight when you've never had wings. The taste of lightning when you've never breathed fire.
Gail looked over his shoulder at the distant campfires, thinking of the men and women who still followed him despite the hopelessness of their position. Thinking of High Cairn beyond the mountains, unaware of the draconic army being assembled to raise it. Pain, he said quietly, is familiar terrain. Seraphine studied him with ancient eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of nations.
Why would you do this? Your kind has hunted mine for generations. Why save hatchlings that might one day turn on your cities?
A fair question. One that Gail had already asked himself during the long, blood-soaked days in the valley. The answer had come to him, ironically, while watching the dragons lay waste to his troops. Because we're more alike than different, he said. Both capable of beauty and horror. Both fiercely protective of our young. He met her gaze steadily. Because someone has to break the cycle. Why not here? Why not now? A low rumble emanated from deep within Seraphine's chest. Not a growl, but something more complex.
In all my centuries, I have known humans only as enemies or prey. Yet here you stand, offering to bear my fire, to save children you've never seen.
Perhaps, Gail suggested, we've both been fighting the wrong war. Moonlight gleamed on Seraphine's scales as she shifted, raising her massive head to full height. For a moment, Gail thought she might strike, end his life with one snap of jaws that could shear through oak. Instead, she lowered her head until they were eye to eye.
Very well, Gail of the Ashguard,
she said, her voice resonant with a decision that seemed to echo across centuries.
We will make a pact of the old world. My fire for your flesh, my brood under your protection. May the Ancient Ones witness and remember.
How do we begin? Seraphine's answer was to exhale softly. Not the devastating flame gout of combat, but a gentle shimmer of heat that smelled of cinnamon and char.
Remove your armor, she instructed. The metal will interfere. And then you must come closer.
Gail did as instructed, stripping down to his breeches despite the mountain chill. His torso, already marked by the scars of a decade at war, looked pale and vulnerable in the moonlight.
The pain will be extreme,
Seraphine warned again.
Few humans have endured it without losing their minds. Are you certain?
Gail thought of the alternative. Retreat, surrender, allowing the Enduit to complete their corruption of dragonkind. He thought of High Cairn in flames, its people screaming as controlled dragons reduced it to ash and memory. But he also thought of 5 hatchlings, hidden in high caves, waiting for a mother who would never return. Innocents in a war they didn't create, facing a future of enslavement or death. I'm certain, he said. Seraphine nodded once, a gesture strangely human for such an ancient being.
Then kneel before me, Gail of the Ashguard, and remember to breathe.
What followed was beyond pain, beyond language. Seraphine exhaled again, but this time, what emerged wasn't merely heat. It was essence. Pure draconic energy, precisely controlled, directing itself at Gail's exposed flesh in patterns that seemed to follow some predetermined design. It burned. Gods, how it burned. Fire traced lines across his chest, his back, his shoulders. Each stroke felt like a talon of molten metal being dragged through his very soul. He couldn't scream, his lungs refused to work. He could only endure, moment by excruciating moment, as dragonfire rewrote him on a fundamental level. Images flashed behind his clenched eyelids. Mountains seen from unseen heights. The world mapped by thermals and wind currents. The joy of first flight. The terror of watching kin fall to human spears. The fierce protectiveness of guarding a clutch of eggs. Memories not his own, bleeding into his consciousness alongside the pain. He felt himself fracturing, identity stretched beyond endurance. Who was he? Gail of the Ashguard? A dragon soaring above ancient forests? A mote of consciousness suspended in endless fire? Just when he thought he would break, would lose himself entirely in the conflagration, a voice reached him, not through his ears, but directly into his mind.
Hold fast, Firebearer. The worst has passed.
The burning sensation began to recede, not to coolness, but to a more manageable heat, like the embers rather than open flame. The foreign memories settled, integrating themselves alongside his own, rather than overwhelming them. How long it lasted, he couldn't say. Time lost meaning beneath the forge heat of transformation. When awareness returned, he was on his hands and knees, forehead pressed against the cool stone. Every breath sent new waves of agony through his reconstructed flesh. But he was alive, conscious, sane insofar as he could tell.
It's done.
Seraphine's voice came from somewhere above and behind him, weaker now.
The bond is formed.
Gail tried to speak, found his throat raw as if he'd been screaming for hours. Perhaps he had been. What? What now? He managed.
Now, you carry my fire, my essence. A piece of my soul lives within you, Gail of the Ashguard. And through you, my hatchlings will always know their heritage.
With enormous effort, Gail pushed himself up to sitting, then nearly collapsed again as he caught sight of his own body. His skin was a tapestry of precisely rendered draconic script, glowing faintly from within, as if embers smoldered beneath the surface. The patterns wrapped around his torso, up his shoulders, and down his arms to the wrists. These marks... he rasped. What do they mean?
Protection, guidance, lineage.
Seraphine's breathing had grown more labored.
And something more. Something I added.
What?
Freedom.
The dragoness's eyes, clearer now than they had been, held a fierce pride.
My brood will be bound to you, yes, but not as slaves or weapons, as kin. They will choose their own path when grown. That is my gift to them. And to you.
Gail stared at her, understanding dawning through the haze of pain. You're dying.
Yes. The transfer took what little strength I had left, but it was a worthy end.
Her massive head lowered until it rested on the stone beside him.
The Andui will feel my passing. They'll come to investigate. You must be gone by then.
The hatchlings.
In the high caves, as I said. 3 days' climb from here, following the eastern ridge. You'll know the place when you reach it. They'll know you too now. The markings will tell them what words cannot.
Gail reached out hesitantly, then placed his hands on Seraphine's scaled snout. The touch sent a jolt through him, not in pain this time, but recognition, connection. I'll protect them, he promised, with everything I am. A sound like distant thunder emanated from the dragoness. A purr, he realized with surprise.
I know,
she said, her voice fading.
That's why I chose you, human, who speaks to dying dragons.
Chose me? But I found you by chance. Seraphine's eyes, already dimming, held a last flicker of ancient amusement.
There is no such thing as chance when fire meets fate, Gail of the Ashguard. Remember that when my children take wing.
Those were her last words. As the moon climbed higher, Seraphine's breathing slowed, then stopped. Her massive form seemed to settle into the stone, as if returning to the mountains from which her kind were said to have first emerged. Gail remained beside her until the first hints of dawn colored the eastern sky. Then, moving with careful deliberation through pain that threatened to overwhelm him, he dressed and made his way back to camp. There were preparations to make, a new mission to undertake, and somewhere in the high peaks, 5 orphan dragon hatchlings who would need guidance in a world determined to weaponize them. The siege of the Ashen Vale was about to take an unexpected turn. In the present, Krug's voice yanked Gail back away from the memories he usually kept firmly locked away.
Those markings,
the orc warlord said, his tone now caught between awe and suspicion.
They speak of a blood pact, but such things are forbidden. No dragon would.
Not forbidden, Gail corrected quietly. Forgotten. There's a difference. The orcish shaman hobbled closer, his ancient eyes squinting at the patterns on Gail's flesh.
The binding symbols, he murmured. Fire channel runes. And there.
He pointed a gnarled finger at Gail's left shoulder.
The lineage mark. This is no counterfeit.
Krug looked from the shaman to Gail, genuine confusion warring with ingrained skepticism on his broad features.
What are ye saying, old one? That this human has dragon blood?
Not blood, the shaman corrected. Bond. An ancient rite from before our people strew borders with blade and flame, when dragons still walked among us as teachers, not terrors. He turned rheumy eyes to Gail. How? The knowledge was lost even to us, and we have kept the old ways. Gail looked past them all, to the distant mountains that rimmed the plateau. Desperation, he said simply, and sacrifice. Before anyone else could respond, he reached down and picked up his sword from where it rested against his leg. The strange, translucent metal caught the sunlight, and for a moment it seemed to ripple with inner fire. "We came here for a duel," he said, his voice once again calm and detached. "Not stories." But the story was written across his flesh for all to see, and as he raised his sword into a guard position, something had changed in his eyes, a coldness entering them that hadn't been there before. The coldness of a man who had walked through fire and emerged not unscathed, but tempered. Not unmarked, but reforged. The ceremonial circle was abandoned for the central pavilion. Gail stood at the center of a ring of curious, wary eyes, refusing to don another shirt. "Chronicles lie," he said, addressing Krug's question about what really happened in the Ashen Vale, especially those written by the victorious. "Then give us the truth," said King Aldemar. A cold smile touched Gail's lips. "Truth isn't yours to dispense, your majesty." He turned back to Krug. "But I'll tell the story. Once." Gail recounted finding Seraphine, the dying dragoness, and their pact to protect her hatchlings from the Anduin sorcerers who sought to control them. Silence reigned in the pavilion as he finished. Finally, the Orcish shaman spoke.
"The hatchlings? Did you find them?"
Gail's eyes snapped back to the present. "Yes." "And?" prompted King Aldemar. "And I kept my promise. That's all that matters."
"The chronicles claim you slaughtered the draconic forces,"
Krug said. A mirthless smile touched Gail's lips. "History is written by those who need legends, not by those who lived them." "But surely the hatchlings couldn't have survived on their own," one of the human lords interjected. "They weren't alone," Gail cut him off sharply. "I stayed with them, taught them, watched them grow." His hands moved unconsciously to his chest. "They called me Fear to Call." "Fire Father," translated the shaman reverently.
"That's why you disappeared after the war,"
Krug realized.
"Where are they now?"
"I won't tell you," Gail said firmly. "They're not weapons to be deployed. Not by humans, not by orcs, not by anyone." King Aldemar cleared his throat diplomatically. "Dragons allied with humankind could fundamentally alter the balance of power." "They're not allied with humankind," Gail corrected sharply. "They're allied with me. There's a difference." "But you are human," the king pressed. "Am I?" Gail raised an eyebrow, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, something ancient and reptilian seemed to look out through his eyes. A distant sound rumbled across the plateau, a roar that seemed to vibrate the very air. Then another, and another. Dark shapes moved against the sky, fire-massive, undulating forms. As they drew closer, wings became visible, talons glinting in the afternoon sun, scales shimmering in colors from obsidian to silver. Dragons.
"Defensive positions!"
shouted the human captain of the guard.
"Hold!"
Krug bellowed.
"They come in peace."
"How could you possibly know that?" demanded King Aldemar. Krug's yellow eyes remained fixed on the approaching dragons.
"Because if they meant war, we would already be ash."
4 dragons remained airborne, circling at a respectful distance, while the 5th, a silver-scaled female with eyes like polished moonstone, landed with surprising delicacy at the edge of the circle. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then the dragoness spoke, her voice resonant yet strangely melodic.
Father bound, she said. We heard your name spoken in steel. Where is he? Where is Gail?
The dragoness asked when no one answered.
"He left,"
Krug said, stepping forward.
"Return to the mountains."
You fought him. You bear his marks.
Her gaze indicated Krug's cuts.
"With honor,"
Krug confirmed.
"and yielded when bested."
Of course you did. Few stand long against fear to call when his blade sings true. I am Lysithea, she announced, firstborn of Seraphine's final clutch. These are my brethren, Obsidiath, Teralith, Pyraxia, and Zephyria.
Why have you come? King Aldemar asked, his voice trembling slightly. Lysithea's gaze fixed on him.
To honor the pact, to witness the peace.
Her head swiveled to regard the combat circle.
But the ritual remains incomplete.
The sound of footsteps drew all eyes to the mountain path. Gail appeared, walking with measured stride. Lysithea, he said simply.
Father-bound,
she replied, lowering her head in respect.
We felt the steel song. I did not expect you to leave before we arrived.
I didn't intend to summon you, Gail said, his voice betraying regret. The ritual wasn't meant to reach so far.
Yet here we are.
Lysithea's head tilted.
You are troubled by our presence?
Not troubled, Gail corrected. Concerned. This gathering was to be discreet.
When has dragonkind ever been discreet? She laughed. We are not made for shadows and whispers.
A small smile touched Gail's lips. No, I suppose not. Kin? Echoed King Aldemar when Gail explained. You claim kinship with the dragons. Not claim, Gail replied. Acknowledge. There's a difference.
We are bound by pact and pain, Lysithea explained. Our mother gave her essence that we might live free of corruption. This one carried that essence through blood and battle when we were too young to bear it ourselves.
He raised you, Krug said, understanding dawning.
He taught us, Lysithea corrected, to hunt, to fly, to remember our heritage and honor our mother's sacrifice.
Lord Faversham stepped forward. Then you are bound to serve humanity through your debt to Gail. The temperature around Lysithea dropped precipitously.
We serve no one, human. Not even him. The pact is of kinship, not servitude.
But surely enough, Gail interrupted sharply. The dragons are not weapons to be deployed.
Will you return with us, father-bound? Lysithea asked, gentleness entering her voice. The high caves stand empty without your presence.
A complex emotion passed through Gail's features. My place was with you while you needed guidance, but that time has passed. You fly your own paths now.
Yet the bond remains.
Always, Gail agreed, his hand moving to his chest. But bonds don't require constant proximity.
With grace that belayed her sighs, Lysithea lowered her head until it was level with Gail's. She extended a serpentine tongue and gently licked his forehead, leaving behind a shimmering mark like a crescent moon. So you are forever known to us, she declared, in darkness or in light, in war or in peace, in life and beyond. With that, she rose to her full height and launched herself skyward. The other dragons called out in unison and joined her in formation. Gail watched them go, his face unreadable save for a brightness in his eyes that might have been the reflection of wings, or might have been something else entirely. Gail stood at the edge of the plateau, his scarred torso still bearing the silvery mark left by Lysithea.
You truly intended to leave without ceremony, Krug observed, approaching. To disappear back into legend? Legends are for bards and politicians, Gail replied. I prefer the quiet. Yet, you harbor the most extraordinary secret of our age. Most men would leverage such power into kingdom or empire. Most men haven't seen what power does to those who grasp it too tightly. Besides, they aren't mine to leverage. No, Krug agreed. But they honor you as father. A shadow passed over Gail's features. Not father. Guardian, perhaps. Teacher, for a time. I was just caretaker of a flame that needed tending. What will you do now? Gail considered, his eyes tracking a hawk riding thermals below. For 13 years, my purpose was clear. Keep them safe, teach them what they needed to survive. Now, from behind his back, Krug produced his axe, now notched where Gail's sword had marked it. Take it, the orc warlord said, offering the weapon hilt first. Among my people, when warriors recognize something true in each other, they exchange blades. Not as trophies, but as witness. Gail hesitated. I had nothing of equal value to offer in return. Krug's tusked mouth twisted into what might have been a smile. You've already given more than you know, Dragon King. After another moment, Gail accepted the axe. The haft was wrapped in leather darkened by years of combat, and protection runes had been etched into the metal. I'll honor it, he promised. I know. Krug's yellow eyes held understanding. Where will you go from here? East, I think, Gail said finally. There are old forests there. Quiet places or legends are still remembered but barely visited. And the dragons? A faint smile touched Gail's lips. They'll find me if they need to. His hand moved to the silvery crescent mark on his forehead. That's what family does. The word seemed to surprise him even as he said it. Family. Not by blood, not by choice exactly, but by something deeper. A connection forged in fire that had, against all odds, transformed into something genuine. As the sun sank lower, the two warriors clasped forearms in the traditional gesture of respect. May your blade stay sharp and your heart warm, Gail of the Ashguard, Krug intoned. And may your enemies flee at the sound of your name, Warlord Krug, Gail replied. With that, they parted, Krug returning to his people, Gail walking the eastern path that wound into the wilderness beyond. Twilight found Gail making camp beside a mountain stream. As darkness fell, he built a small fire, not for warmth, but for the companionship of light in a vast wilderness. The flames reminded him of nights spent watching 5 young dragons learn to control their first breath flames. Lysithea, always the most precise. Obsidious, compensating for lack of finesse with raw power. Terelith, cautious and methodical. Pyraxia, impulsive and brilliant. And Zephyria, the youngest, who had struggled the longest but ultimately manifested the rarest gift, fire that healed rather than harmed. I'm proud of what you become, he said aloud to the empty air. From high above came a distant roar, so faint it might have merely been wind through stone. But Gail knew better. He raised his hand in acknowledgement, and somewhere in the darkening sky, a silver-scaled guardian banked away. Some bonds transcend the boundaries of species and circumstance. Gail lay back, watching sparks rise to meet stars. For the first time in 13 years, his path forward was unwritten, the thought both liberating and terrifying. But as he drifted toward sleep, Gail realized something fundamental had changed. The weight he had carried since the Ashen Veil, the crushing responsibility, the belief that survival alone was victory, had lightened, not disappeared. The dead would always walk with him, as would Seraphine's sacrifice. But alongside them now walked 5 living proofs that pain could transform into purpose, that protection could become connection, that even in the ashes of war something honorable could take root and grow. Not redemption, he was pragmatic enough to know that such clean narratives existed only in bards' tales. But continuation, the chance to carry forward, not just endure. High above, unseen against the night sky, 5 shapes circled once more before winging their way back to high caves, leaving their Firefather to find his own way as he had once taught them to find theirs. By morning, the stone that had cracked when the dragon-influenced blood touched its surface had transformed. The fissure now formed a perfect rendering of two hands clasped in the traditional warrior's grip, one hand clearly human, the other unmistakably orcish. And beneath them, rendered in ancient script, a single phrase: "What fire divides, ash may join." Within months, a settlement grew around the stone, a place of neutral ground where former enemies could meet in peace. They called it Ashmark. As for Gail, stories varied. Mountain travelers occasionally reported seeing a solitary figure moving through remote passes, sometimes accompanied by a massive silver shape in the sky. But perhaps most telling were the accounts from the high country shepherds, who sometimes glimpsed 5 magnificent dragons circling a distant peak. In their center, they claimed, stood a human figure with arms outstretched in greeting, not in supplication or command, but in the simple welcome of family long separated and joyfully reunited. These tales reminded listeners that strength comes in many forms, some obvious like the power of dragons in flight, others subtle like the quiet dignity of a man who chose to bear pain rather than inflict it. And perhaps most importantly, they suggested that even after the darkest conflicts, something new could emerge from the ashes. Something unexpected and precious. Something like peace.